Welcome to Organizing Upgrade's strategy session on electoral strategy for an independent left. Thanks so much for being here. As a way of introducing what we're doing tonight, I wanted to start by saying that over the past few years, there's been major shifts in the electoral landscape. And maybe now we take for granted the importance of sort of linking grassroots struggles to electoral strategies, but even 3 years ago, that really couldn't have been said that was sort of a common view for social movement leftists. And even though, there's been a lot of electoral organizing groups that have sort of been developing and refining their work over many years, it still just couldn't have been generalized that the condition we're in now, where it's relatively assumed that this is the key line of work, couldn't have been assumed just a few years ago. Not only have new and old organizers turned increasingly to electoral strategies strategies for achieving broader movement goals. Along the way, these organizations have gained a wealth of new experience, but there's also been a significant increase in new electoral organizations, new electoral experiments across our movements. Despite all of this activity, there's still really no firm agreement on an overarching strategy. This sort of reflects that across our movements, there's differing views still on what's possible to win in the electoral realm and for the sake of what broader goals. And there's differing views on how to view the Democratic Party and our relationship to it. There's still differing views on which groups of people are sort of the foundation for the kind of left-led mass movement that we're all interested in building inside of the electoral process. So this call is really about, it's another attempt, right? This is a debate that's ongoing, but this is another attempt to try to answer some of these questions with leading thinkers from across some of the most impactful groups engaging in this type of work. So though we hope that this strategy session can clarify the different approaches to doing this work, we do take it as sort of a basic assumption that the people on this call share a desire in some way to build an organized and independent left and mass political vehicle, some new type of organization that's independent to achieve some of our broader goals. And we hope that tonight's call can build on that level of unity. So let me start by introducing our panelists. This is in no particular order. We have Maurice Mitchell, the National Director of the Working Families Party. We have David Duhalde, the Political Director of Our Revolution. Kayla Reed from the Movement for Black Lives Electoral Justice Project. Andrea Mercado, the ED of New Florida Majority and on the leadership team of the State Power Caucus. Luke Elliott-Negri from DSA. Ashley Henderson, the co-director of the Highlander Center, an active participant in Movement for Black Lives and on the Governance Council of the Southern Movement Assembly. John Liss, the executive director of New Virginia Majority and the chair of the State Power Caucus. Beth Huang, the co-chair of Boston DSA. And then Linda Burnham, the former research director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and me, Rishi from Organizing Upgrade, are going to be co-moderating this event. And the way that we're going to do it is we have a handful of questions that most of the panelists have seen and grappled with in some way before this call. We're going to have a sort of talk show format to get into some of those questions. We'll close in the last 5 minutes with Linda Burnham giving us a sort of summary and forward-looking concluding comments. That was a long introduction, but why don't we go ahead and dive in? So I'll ask the first question. And Andrea, this first question is coming to you, though others should feel free to jump in at some point. We wanted to really start by grounding the conversation in, what's in motion in social movements that are sort of engaging on the electoral front, and in particular, sort of what is it that your organization, your network has been doing in this area that we should all be paying attention to, and how do you see it as sort of an important part of left strategy?
Happy to go first. No, I mean, I think, well, first of all, just to ground my comments, New Florida Majority is an independent racial justice organization that's focused on really building political power, independent of any political party, that's really centering the needs of Black and Brown communities specifically. And I think for us, and I think one of the things that's really interesting about Florida right now is because of the political dynamic in Florida, where we swing in presidentials, but the right wing has had a trifecta on our state politics for over 20 years. So that means that they've totally dismantled. We have no Department of Labor in the state. Medicaid expansion hasn't been implemented. Every year there's like more cutbacks to our schools. Florida's where Trayvon Martin was murdered, and where Stand Your Ground like still reigns. And so, I mean, I think for us in Florida, many of the organizations over the last 10 years have been really grappling with this question of engaging in electoral politics from a racial justice perspective. And in a context where like we're up against the best funded Republican Party in the nation. Like the Koch brothers infrastructure in the state is massive. They're contesting for people's hearts and minds every day. And I think when we started to get involved in electoral politics, it was this question of like, can we learn how to do this work at that kind of scale, with that kind of rigor and discipline? And then pretty quickly, I think, realized that we were going to be used by Democratic Party political operatives and the consulting class, unless we were able to align our forces that were kind of engaging in electoral politics. And so over the last few years, we've been building out the statewide alignment group as a space for organizations like New Florida Majority to come together with Dream Defenders and the Florida Immigrant Coalition and Organized Florida and SEIU and others, for us to really think about what's our long-term plan, like what's our North Star, and where do we want to be in 10 years? Because what we were finding was election cycle after election cycle, we weren't kind of coming out the other side feeling like we had actually really made a clear advance. And so we were hungry for a long-term plan that we could situate our shorter term and medium term campaigns within. And I think for us, that's really been a game changer. And that's, I think the kind of trust that we've built in that process has enabled us to like move differently in the work, where we can be more strategic about our division of labor, where we can say, last year, after years of groundwork, when, Desmond Meade of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition said, we're going to move on the ballot initiative, we were all able to say, okay, let's go. And that's going to be our number one priority. And together we knocked on over 1 million doors talking to people about Amendment 4 and talking to people that are usually ignored by both political parties, that nobody's talking to because they're not a likely voter in a midterm. And I think the other, piece I would say in terms of what's like something to watch is something that we all watched last cycle is, in Florida, where the Democratic Party has consistently run to the middle and believes that they have to run like super moderate or former Republicans to win statewide races. We went hard and ran one of the largest field programs for Andrew Gillum in the primary. He had a total upset in that primary and officially came within 30,000 votes of being the governor of the state of Florida, and where no one thought that a Black man running on a progressive platform could ever win statewide office 2 or 3 years ago. I think we were able to really prove our theory of the case that when you run candidates from our communities that are speaking about like bold issues that can really connect with what people need and what people want, you can expand the electorate and you can win. But, I think we're still, still really looking at how the right will steal votes, will suppress votes, kind of still pulling our hair out by the way in which it always feels like we're just coming up less than 1 percentage point short, but also acknowledging how much ground we've gained. Amendment 4 won by a total landslide. That's 1.4 million Floridians. who were systematically disenfranchised, that, you know, we now have the opportunity to register and to organize. And we know that we can't take that for granted, because there's 100 million people in the country, US citizens, who didn't vote in 2016. And that's, you know, it's not, you know, clearly political parties aren't what is energizing them and getting them out to vote on election day. That's like truly, I think, a task for organizing. And that's, you know, one of the reasons why I've been excited to figure out, like, how do we really apply social movement energy into this world of electoral politics, and figure out if we can match the science of doing field with like the art of organizing, and really like breathe some life and some momentum into these campaigns, so that we can, you know, make the impossible possible, and really fundamentally change like the politics of what's possible, which for those of us that are, you know, in red states and dealing with what that means for our families and our communities every day, take really seriously.
That's great, Andrea, thanks. We're gonna wanna hear more about that 10-year plan later on this call, as much as you feel like you can share, so we'll circle back to you on that. But I wanted to come to David. Same question to you. What's in motion that we should be paying attention to, in particular, inside of the organizations that you work with?
Great, thanks so much. And it was really honor to be on this panel. I just want to thank you guys again for hosting it. So I'm David. I work for Our Revolution. Though we went into this panel saying we'll speak for ourselves only, so that's true for me. But I'll give you guys a broader sense of what my organization is doing and how it relates to the question. So Our Revolution, as many know, but it's worth repeating, is a kind of Bernie Sanders inspiration organization coming out of his 2016 campaign. So largely, if you look at what we believe, it's just copy and paste from his 2016 platform, frozen in time with some additions. But what's interesting about Our Revolution in the kind of history of legacy organizations from presidential campaigns is that Our Revolution really is very independent of Senator Sanders, for reasons I will not do on a recorded call. But I think it's objectively true that he kind of lets Our Revolution do what it's going to do. We are, very much tied to his agenda, so we do support, especially legislative policies, not just Medicare for all, but also work around Yemen, the Yemen Wars resolution. So there is kind of an echo chamber solidarity there, but we really are organizing based on like what we describe as a triangle, which is that we have about 200 active groups and 600 on paper who are the core in the center of the triangle. And the three issues we work on, the three sides of the triangle are issues. So that's like social, Medicare for all, immigrant rights, et cetera, campaign finance reform is heavily popular with our membership. Candidates, so what I do as the political director primarily is focused on electing candidates. 99% of our national endorsements come from grassroots nominations from our base. We very much do not do candidate recruitment. We're not, people send me candidates all the time and I kind of just say thank you. It's really a directed program, which I think is a strength of us. And then lastly is kind of party reform work. So that, that's sometimes can be kind of inside baseball-y, but we do focus on Democratic Party, both national, state, and local reform. So an example would be the Union Reform Commission. We really did play a leadership role a lot of people didn't see in making sure that the Democratic Party on a national level did adopt reforms that were proposed at the 2016 National Convention. And we really steered that process. And most recently, we worked with the nurses, the National Nurses United, and their California affiliate, Progressive Democrats, in electing about 600 of the 1,000 California delegates to the party, who about a third of the delegates that go to the California Democratic Convention are located at the assembly level. So with that note is like, I would say like using language I think this group would be used to is like kind of our revolution has filled kind of a social democratic void in American politics, kind of inheriting somewhat what DSA used to do, especially around party work. But even more in the 80s and 90s DSA, like DSOC, which was like one of the successor organizations and really focusing on changing the Democratic Party and really explicitly talking about kind of Scandinavia and other welfare states as a model to go to. So it's not a socialist organization per se at all. But what it does have is kind of this broad coalition, if you will, of what I usually say is like two tendencies. So one is the social democrats would include democratic socialists like me, trade unionists, people who are actually social democrats, and then the left populists who kind of, and like the people who are attracted to Nina Turner, people who are very anti-establishment, but are looking for, government to be a force for good. So those are kind of the social base of what I would say is our revolution, though it's not unlike, these are not formalized factions or anything. This is just my 2 cents about who are the broadest people. So I think what's interesting for us, and is coming into this election that, obviously it's no surprise that we endorsed Senator Sanders for president. But what I'll just say before I hand it over back to you all is somebody asked me, one of our members asked me when I was in the Bay, what are we going to do to hold Senator Sanders accountable when if he gets elected? And what I said is like, you build organization. And I think what's really excites me about our revolution and the organizations on this call is there is a sense that we're not going to be the organizing for America. We're not supposed to be the cheerleaders for any administration, but the idea is building infrastructure. And I think what I'd like to, talk more about, and the other questions about how do you make that relationship, a positive one that's that is complementary. It doesn't have to be inherent. Just because you're not a cheerleader doesn't mean you have to be totally antagonistic either. But I think that's broadly where our revolution is situated, kind of filling it's a more explicitly, but more often implicitly social democratic space in American politics.
Great, thank you, David. Really helpful. Ashley, I'd love to hop over to you if you'd love to field the same question. What's in motion? What are groups that you've been involved in? What are they up to that we should all be paying attention to?
Sure. Hey, good evening, everybody. So I'm Ash Henderson, and I'm the first Black woman executive director of the Highlander Research and Education Center. Most of y'all know what Highlander does. We've been bringing people together to figure it out since 1932. And so we're still in that work of bringing grassroots folks together to come up with concrete analysis of concrete conditions where they live and figure out what they're going to do about it together. And we're still doing that work. I'll talk a little bit about what we've been able to observe, what I've been able to observe, because again, wearing so many hats in so many places representing Highlander and the movement for Black Lives, which Kayla, I'm sure, is going to talk more about in a bit, and through our position on the Governance Council of the Southern Movement Assembly, which is hundreds of participating organizations and about 14 organizations on the Governance Council that's also building alternatives to the state for and by Southern people. So I'm going to give you a little bit of analysis that's sort of synthesized from doing work in all of those spaces. To the original question, Rishi, I mean, you asked about social movements, and obviously our beautiful and brilliant left is not the only sort of political, ideological space that's building social movement. And what we know for sure in the South, and would argue that it's true everywhere else, is that the Christian supremacist, white nationalist, Zionist right is vying for and consolidating their political power and wealth. In some ways, in many ways, based on what they've learned from our tactics and strategies over decades worth of movement building. And we've seen that rear its ugly head in places like Pikeville, Kentucky, or what many folks saw in Charlottesville, Virginia. Also, Unite the Right 2.0 happened just down the street from Highlander in Middle Tennessee, right? Tennessee was one of the, if not the only place that ran a White Lives Matter candidate. And so we've seen this and the attacks on the wins and victories of the reproductive justice movement. We've seen folks pass policies that are good for profit but bad for our environment that we live in and for our people, et cetera. And so while all that's happening, I think what Southerners have come to see is that, and I think we would argue, is that it's not a new strategy that we're seeing. I'm going to put in the chat box a link to the comedian Samantha Bee's video on the religious right. If you check it out, you'll see that actually their plan, the plan that we would argue led to the birth of the Tea Party, is actually a 50-year strategy that is well into work, right? So some of us recognize that this isn't a political moment. This is actually a pendulum swing in response to a lot of what we've built. And I think some of us would say that most of the red states that are not swing states aren't swinging because we've been conceded by the left to just be places that will forever and always be the folks that vote against their best interests. I think we'd also assess that neoliberalism is killing us too, just maybe a little bit slower. That if we look at some of the municipalities and races that we've seen for municipal government, that when we've got Democrats in those seats that are not accountable to our people, that we end up having blue spots with some of the highest concentration of low-wage workers. With at one point, one of the fastest gentrifying zip code in the country was in the South, in Tennessee, where a zip code, a community went from double digits Black to double digits white in a year. We see the criminalization of Blackness and brownness, the over-policing of our communities, and rapidly increasing numbers of incarcerated people, particularly people of color and very specifically Black people. And we see the expansion of extractive industries, whether it's coal or oil or fracking or tourism or all the other things that we don't think of when we think about extraction of resources. But I think the point of your question, Rishi, was actually, what's the good news, right? So let me tell you about the gospel of the Southern Freedom Movement. We're also building despite those realities, and sometimes because of those realities, through electoral campaigns that are changing what people believe is possible in our region. So thinking about our comrades in Jackson, Mississippi, where both Chokwe Lumumba and then his son Anti Lumumba became Black nationalists that are the mayor of the capital city of arguably one of the most white supremacist states in the country. Thinking about Alabama and the work that the formerly and currently incarcerated People's Movement, along with folks like Black Voters Matter and other base building and grassroots organizations, did to oust Roy Moore and get Doug Jones in the seat, which actually had nothing to do with either of them and very much more about building Black independent political power. Or whether we're thinking about Georgia and Florida in the most recent elections, one that Andrea just told you about, and that most of us argue Andrew won. And then obviously with Stacey Abrams, who we know did. Just thinking about her race in the primary, right? There are 159 counties in the state of Georgia. In the primary, Stacey won 156 of those counties. So the idea that somehow these states are not organizable, we know to just not be true. And we also know that as goes the South, so goes the nation isn't an opinion, it's a fundamental fact. So knowing those things as we're making our concrete assessment of concrete conditions and thinking about how that impacts strategy electorally is really important. We're also seeing folks building alternatives, like using people's movement assemblies. They're doing it in Jackson. We've been doing it all over the region, especially after Hurricane Katrina, where we realized we didn't have the infrastructure to be able to save our own folks. So thinking about people's movement assemblies, not just as a convening where people come together and are intellectually stimulated, but how to use that as an organizing process, and particularly how we use it to self-govern, right? Both our movements and our region. So we're seeing folks building those alternatives and not just being dependent on the state or doing harm reduction through electoral strategies. The last couple of things that I would say is that we're recognizing more and more outside, not we already knew this, but folks outside of the region, I think, are realizing and recognizing that the South is the largest geographic region in the United States. And so if you're gonna organize to win here, you can't leave us out of the conversation. And in fact, if you don't start with us, you're missing a huge chunk of people. And then if you believe in ending white supremacy and combating and uprooting so it can never go back again, anti-Black racism, the largest concentration of Black people is also in that largest geographic region that is the South. And so we're learning more and more about what is possible in the Black Belt, what is possible across the region through much of the work that folks like Kayla and Jessica Bird and Rakela Moomba are doing through the Movement for Black Lives, that folks like Latasha Brown and Cliff Albright are doing through Black Voters Matter, through the fight for reenfranchisement that folks like Kenny Glasgow with the Ordinary People Society and Desmond are doing, that are leading the currently and formerly incarcerated people's movement in Florida and Alabama. What we know is that when our elders and ancestors said by any means necessary, they meant by all the means, all the tactics. That not engaging in electoral strategy is a luxury that our people down here cannot afford. We need people that will run. We need people that can win. We're seeing that happen. We're seeing the impact of base building and groundwork actually changing the tide of what is possible. And we're organizing, and that is that's why so many amazing Southerners are on this call tonight. So I'm going to stop there because I'm excited to hear from them.
Thank you, Ashley. That was from all three really brilliant, very helpful. So we heard about the challenges of sort of combating, an ascendant and emboldened right. We heard about the problem of neoliberal Democrats and neoliberalism generally, but sort of the conservative wing of the Democratic Party, which might, there's different ways to understand the Dems. And then we heard about a bunch of the sort of experiments that are sort of popping off and are really linked to deep organizing work. One thing that all those efforts have in common is that, they're happening all over the place. They're all very different types of strategies, and we're there's not a full consolidation yet. So I want to pivot I'm going to hand it over to Linda to talk more about that problem.
So thanks everybody for the contributions and conversation. I want to move us on to this issue that Rishi just alluded to, which is we came into 2016 as a pretty fragmented, uncoordinated, not united on strategy left. And we've made some progress since then in a number of different ways. And some of the work that you all have alluded to is already indicative of higher levels of coordination. But I guess the question I want to pose to you all is, what are higher levels of coordination on the part of the left desirable? What might it take to achieve that? And what's standing in the way? I guess also, this is multiple questions all at the same time. Are there initiatives that we should know about beyond the ones that folks have already discussed that move in the direction of higher levels of coordination in terms of folks who are thinking about electoral work in the context of longer term strategy? So I want to pose that question first of all to Beth. Is that something you'd want to speak to?
Sure, absolutely. And it's an honor to be joining all of you. I'm the co-chair of the Boston Democratic Socialists of America. We have 1,800 members in Greater Boston, which I think makes us a mini mass organization here. So I think there are a couple of components to this question. So the first is that in DSA, the political conditions vary greatly from chapter to chapter. Even within the 6 chapters within Massachusetts, the conditions are quite different across the different cities. And so I think with the national electoral strategy, something that I think is really smart about DSA's strategy is that it's called All Politics Are Local. And so what that speaks to is, as leftists and in DSA as socialists, we know that material conditions and analysis of the material and political conditions are absolutely necessary to forming good strategy that builds power. And while we want to be respectful of the difference in political conditions, we also want to have a shared set of principles and leverage the huge 55,000 member network of chapters 49 of 50 states in the country. There is a comrade in Delaware who wants to start a chapter. I'd invite you to find a couple comrades. And so what I think is important is that DSA is so much more than just an email list. You know, we have active membership in almost every state in the country. And what's important is we're building organization, especially amongst young people, many of whom are in cities. And something that I want to point out about young voters and young people in Boston and many cities is that we're facing high rent, high student loan payments. Many of us are trapped in the entry-level jobs because of the recession. And what that means is that many of us are never going to own a home. Many of us are downwardly mobile, and many of us live paycheck to paycheck, which makes our interests materially very similar to people who have been permanently working class. And often we actually live in different parts of big metropolitan areas because of residential segregation. And so actually there is kind of some benefit to working in coalitions with left organizations. So in Boston DSA, we work with Right to the Cities 501c4 coalition. And so there is a really important local component to our electoral work. That being said, our national electoral work is really important. Ensuring that we use this endorsement of Senator Sanders for president to build the local infrastructure is really important. And we will need resources from the National Electoral Committee, such as training, especially around legal compliance, since so many people in DSA in all chapters across the country are relatively new to organizing and don't know the ins and outs of legal compliance. We also do national endorsements that come from the local chapters, which is really important since we want to build organization. And so if there's no base on the ground supporting this candidate, then the national doesn't endorse them. But also when there is a national endorsement, other chapters jump in to help. So right now, actually, I'm missing a phone bank for Rossana Rodriguez, who's a DSA member in Chicago, who's running for alderwoman. And so while there are resources to leverage, there also is a really strong notion that all politics are local. And so there is this balance between centralization and coordination, centralization and decentralization while coordinating resources in DSA, which has been, I think, a pathway to power for people involved in electoral politics and are socialists.
Thank you for that, Beth. Appreciate it. I want to move the same question over to Mo, if you would. So I think what part of this is to really dig into what has stood in the way of higher levels of coordination on the part of the left and the kind of multiplicity of organizations, which is not in and of itself a bad thing. But are there ways in which higher levels of coordination might get us to higher levels of being able to leverage the power and agenda of folks on the left side of the political spectrum?
Sure, thank you so much. And it's a true honor to be on this call with so many people I respect and some who I've been working with in very deep collaboration for years. To answer that question, so I've been thinking about this a lot because one of the things that a political party is, especially when it's healthy and it's vibrant, is it's a container for a number of entities and different forces, right? And potentially a political party could be a meaningful space in order for a number of tendencies across the left to engage in an electoral united front sort of strategy, right? And much of my work, so I just started as the National Director of the Working Families Party in August, so this is my 8th month. And part of my work around transforming the Working Families Party is to create the conditions under the party where we could begin to experiment with that very question that you posed, right? Where a number of tendencies and a number of organizations could utilize the tools of the party as a place to engage in struggle together, but also throw down together around electoral targets. And to look at the party as being an electoral expression of a non-sectoral electoral expression of the left. And, you know, part of the reasons why I think the conditions haven't, you know, my analysis is that because one of the conditions that don't allow for us to do that is the fact that we don't have party structures. I don't think the Working Families Party needs to be the only party, but I think certainly we could be one of many people who are attempting to experiment with this type of electoral organizing, where we're explicitly trying to develop non-sectoral platforms for a number of left entities and left organizations and mass organizations to throw down together, even as they struggle around really important ideas. The other thing I would say is that, to me, the goal of any left is not necessarily to consolidate the left, right? The goal is to organize the working class, right? One of the sort of intermediary steps may be the consolidation of some forces on the left in order to amass enough power and amass enough capacity to be able to organize the working class, right? And so to that end, I don't think we should seek unity for unity's sake. I don't fetishize unity. I think, you know, I think creating alignment of forces that are deeply aligned around strategy, around ideology, and have political trust to be able to throw down together. And when contradictions arise, that trust, ideological alignment and strategic alignment keeps the alignment together. I think that requires a stronger, tighter, but perhaps smaller alignment of forces in order to amass enough power so that you have enough capacity to actually engage in this big project, but you aren't such a broad coalition that you are unwieldy or so ideologically stretched and that you can't actually, you kind of end up taking the lowest common denominator position instead of the ideologically sharp position. And so what I'm trying to practice with the Working Families Party is to engage in an alignment that with forces that are ready to go, have some practice with each other so there's some trust, have some remaining non-sectoral, have some ideological alignment and strategic alignment. And even then, there's gonna be a lot of debate, a lot of struggle. But I think that the broad table doesn't cut it. You need a sharper cut. Still broad enough that you have enough capacity so you're not just talking to your friends, but not so broad that you know, for example, the Democratic Party is a perfect example of you have people who identify as socialists and people in the financial industry in the same party. And it isn't a flat structure. The folks in the financial industry and the folks in organized capital, the organized capital wing of the Democrats, are clearly the ruling wing, whereas everybody on the left flank are kind of at best sort of third tier, second tier partners at best. And so that, to me, that alignment sort of demonstrates the fallacy of everybody just like linking arms and throwing down together. You need a sharper ideological cut, I think, to build enough capacity in order to engage in some structural change. Because, you know, where you have two wings where they have deeply opposed structural agendas, it's going to lead to, I think, some point, some form of rupture. And again, because it isn't a flat structure, the folks who are the sort of leading forces in that coalition will be able to crush or to silence the forces that are kind of along for the ride in that point of rupture, which is why I feel like it's so, even as we have folks who are leftists who are organizing in the Democratic Party, it's essential that we build our own institutions outside of the Democratic Party, especially for that point of rupture.
Thank you so much for that, Mo. Appreciate it. Kayla, I want to move that same question to you about coordination, higher levels of coordination, what stands in the way, any examples of things we want to lift up where we feel like we're really making progress?
Awesome. So hi, everyone. My name is Kayla Reed. I'm with the Movement for Black Lives Electoral Justice Project and Action St. Louis. So for us at EJP, what we understand is that, you know, we are aligned with what basically Mo just said, is this idea that maybe coordination is not the goal, but connection and political alignment is certainly the goal. And what we've identified as Movement for Black Lives is a North Star, which is our vision for Black Lives policy that was released well before the November 2016 election. And what we understand in our theory of change is that grassroots organizations are key to the process of building the power necessary to really leverage wins. And even in the face of loss, we understand that if we're really leaning into movement building, that we've grown and shown more power because of our commitment to political education and base building. And so what we are focused on is not organizing just national organizations or regional organizations, but really focusing on local grassroots organizations. The Movement for Black Lives is made up of these organizations, and EJP's commitment is to not have a top-down approach to organizing or power building, but to be a resource and partner for local organizations to be able to self-determine a strategy to build power in their communities, and to convene spaces where strategies can be shared across localities and lessons can be learned toward applying to the field to build that power. Some of the best wins that we've had before 2016 and after 2016 have been movement wins, whether that is within Democratic cities like St. Louis or Chicago, or within states. So Missouri, for example, we had two major wins in 2018. One within St. Louis, which is a majority Democratic space, by ousting a very conservative prosecutor, and statewide in a state where we also have a Republican trifecta, and passing the minimum wage. And so what we understood is that coordination is certainly a tactic, but connection mattered a lot. So within our state, we had coalitions that were at work around political alignment. And within St. Louis, we were also building those coalitions that share political alignment towards those goals. And so when we think nationally, we are certainly thinking about the need for coordination for shared strategy and political trust, but making sure that we don't replicate problematic tendencies like having a top-down approach. And we see that a lot with national organizations, that they come into communities with kind of this rubber stamp idea of how to build power, and it doesn't stick. And we want to make sure that our investments are focused on organizations, building organizations. And I think that that's really a key to winning, that the left has to accept, is really investing in leadership and organizations that will be in those communities beyond an election cycle. And so that we're moving relationships away from this kind of exploitative relationship where we're extracting votes, and we're actually investing in a strategy that's building power. And I think if we decide that, and we're moving toward that North Star aligned, then the connection and coordination will happen.
Great. Thank you for that. Are there any others who on the panel who want to weigh in on this question of higher levels of coordination? What stands in the way? Other ways to reframe that, which a couple of panelists have just done.
I had a small point, Linda, this is Andrea. I think just like a baseline of like what's the baseline coordination we need to be effective and impactful. So for example, I think oftentimes organizations are so siloed to their issue area or to their neighborhood that when they're looking at politics, they might only be looking at it like from this narrow slice. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is really think about not just statewide theories of change, but can we actually drill down like county by county? This is what it would take to get to a progressive majority in the Miami-Dade, county commissioners, or, these are, in Broward County, where you have Democrats that control the county commission, like this is what it takes to hold their feet to the fire, or to get out that neoliberal Dem or that corporate Dem and replace them with somebody who could be a real champion. I think that level of coordination is oftentimes missing and is just really necessary, which doesn't necessarily mean like you're acting in in ideological alignment, but at least like, are we coming to the table to really talk about the political shifts that need to occur, and how we might get there, even just to surface like different points of view, and then to understand what the different strategies are and how we're moving in that direction.
Great, thank you. Anybody else on this before we move on?
Just one more quick thing. I would also throw out the majority, which is a project of the Movement for Black Lives, is a particular movement-oriented space that's bringing together people of color that have decision-making power in organizations, both local, regional, and national, that are cross-sector, to do work around movement mapping, to like identify and engage shared targets, to build freedom and think tanks and action tanks, and to build local power. And so for those of us that are watching it or participating in it, just seeing these folks come together across all of their differences to try to figure out what alignment and unity and principled struggle around politics can look like. It's a particular body of the left to watch.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to turn it back over to Rishi.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks again, everyone, for those answers. That was lots of insight there. We're going to pivot to talk about long-term strategy now, which is a question I'm especially excited about. But just to lift up that, some of what we heard inside of that last round of answers is, the sort of need for resourcing local strategies. So national organizations, one of the critical sort of layers of coordination is in giving local folks the sort of tools and resources they need to wage better and stronger fights. And, I think Andrea is getting to even more specific, like, how do we coordinate for just deeper local impact, and build the tools we need for that on that level. And then, I think Mo's asking a lot of questions, some of which I think relate very much to what we're about to talk about. So why don't we dive into that? So look, in some ways, the reason that different immediate tendencies inside of the electoral arena emerge now is because there's either different explicit or implicit strategies or strategic assumptions we have about sort of what the longer term struggle is, even if we don't have the long-term strategy yet. And so I want to ask about long-term strategy, not to put pressure on anybody to sort of have the answer of what the long-term strategy is, because that's just not how that's going to emerge. But I think it'd be good to start to talk about, beyond 2020, beyond Trump, how is it that the left should really be thinking about what's the long-term electoral strategy? Is it about, we need one party, one independent party? Is it, we just need to be sort of a left wing inside of the Democrats and, help that structure erode over time and take it over? Is it, it's just about sort of build up our movement forces and, whatever the movement does, we should follow, we should help build, but it's not about necessarily independent political action? Or is it something else much more ambitious? Let's get into sort of like, how do we think about any of these questions in long-term strategy? And I want to come to both John and Luke to give us a first cut on that. Let me start with John.
Thanks, Rishi, and thanks to organizing Upgrade for pulling this together. I think I'll try, to some extent I won't answer that question, but I'll answer what I think, a different question. So the gist of it is the mess we're in now is the product of decades of sort of misplaced priorities, federal focus, geared towards middle of the road voters in terms of the orientation of the Democratic Party, and national networks and national activity always geared towards the next great thing or the next bill that's just about to pass but just doesn't quite make it. And so I would, we got the State Power Caucus, and in Virginia, we take a look at long-term state nationwide. There's 40 million people that is really our, broadly, everybody on this call, sort of social base. Majority people of color, younger folks, often either disenfranchised by laws or in practice. And our sense is it's that 40 million that we need to figure out how to up our game, our organized game, so that tens of millions of more folks are participating in elections. And I think just having that sort of change gives a basis for talking about a different kind of politics. So that's one piece to it. A second piece we would look at is sort of the overdetermined importance of, again, long-term strategy, drilling back into the states, is that the federal power, the federal sort of white nationalist majority that has been running the presidency and beyond is, again, a product of essentially fixing the system, rigging the system, to use their language, rigging the system in terms of districts, who can vote, who can't vote, and then drawing from the local to the state. And so if you always have a 20 or 30 or more seat advantage at the national level, you can always run federal policy. So we would look back and say, what are the kind of united fronts or united efforts that we can build with many of the organizations represented on this call at a state-by-state basis? And I would push another long-term sort of strategic sort of goal should be figuring out how to sort of institutionalize organizing. And there's roughly 20 state organizations in the State Power Caucus, many like New Virginia Majority or New Florida Majority. But how does structural or institutional organizing link up or work better with distributive organizing, the sort of new wave, movement for Black Lives, Mi Gente, et cetera? How do we actually create more of those intersections and more porous relations? Because that's the only way we're going to get to the scale that I think we need. And then I think the other longer term thing, and again, this isn't directly asking or answering, do we burrow within the Democratic Party or what do we do there? But really, how do we create not in an electoral sense, but a party-like structure where we can actually get groups of people who can agree on a strategy, can agree on a collective practice, can get together after they try to do that practice for a while, sum it up, make some changes, and do it again. I think in the absence of that, in the absence of political instruments, some call it political party and others, but in the absence of some kind of political space, and I view this organizing upgrade call as even a step towards that. How do we create those spaces where I would argue, both nationally, but particularly state by state, where can we develop an approach that actually builds from the ground up and actually has a shared collective practice so we can have summaries and adjust accordingly.
Thanks, John. That was great. Let me come to Luke.
Hi, everyone. It's a great conversation. I'm really glad to be with everyone on the call. I'm going to answer this question by answering the last question and then looping back around to this. I really liked what Maurice said about not fetishizing coordination. And I think part of what's exciting in this moment is there are a number of different organizations, with a different set of strategies, some more explicit and some more implicit. And I think in some ways our role is to be nice to each other across our boundaries, build relationships, and to see which strategies play out successfully. And then maybe some of us are just going to jump into other formations and organizations as those strategies play out. And I think, to me, the most concrete, example of this in recent history in my little orbit is, I'd never joined a socialist organization in my life. There was a bunch of small ones, and then all of a sudden there was one that had 50,000 people. So I thought, geez, that's somewhere I want to be. I want to move with that and see what's possible there. And so in some ways, I think to not fetishize coordination, but to kind of build your organization, and then we'll see, which of us become kind of mass, is a good approach. In terms of what to do with the Democratic Party, I guess I would say, on the one hand, I think, the approach that we need to be purely outside of them. I don't think there's anyone on this call who takes that approach. But I think the development of the primary system essentially over the course of the 20th century and the kind of wresting of candidate selection away from the Democratic Party organization, makes it a pretty obvious place to go in terms of operating on the Democratic Party ballot line. And then in terms of what happens in the medium term, I mean, I kind of already know that Rishi doesn't love this answer, but like, I feel like it's really hard to say what's gonna happen. I think in some ways our organizations have to look at races, recruit folks to run in those races, win where we can win, often on the Democratic Party ballot line and sometimes not. And then I think we'll see where things head. I mean, I'd be very curious to see if Bernie Sanders, becomes the Democratic nominee. Maurice referred to, the kind of organized capital wing of, the Democratic Party. Where those folks head? Do they continue to invest in this organization in the same way? So I think in some ways, like, we need to build the power of our organizations in the medium run, watch as, just watch as trends develop, and then also watch what our opponents do, where they move and where they put their money and resources. And I think that will in some ways determine what becomes possible for us.
Great, thanks, Luke. So lots of good suggestions in there, and I think probably like a good sort of intuitive pivot from both speakers to think about sort of the medium run, perhaps more than the long term. But I want to open this up to the rest of the panelists to tackle this question, either about sort of long-term strategy. What is our end game? What is the sort of outcome? What is achievable through electoral strategies that we think we should be pursuing? And sort of what are the medium to long-term shifts that we can make along the lines that John and Luke just put out? Y'all can just unmute yourselves and talk when you're ready.
I'd like to get on stack, but I just wanted to give somebody who hasn't spoken a chance if there's anyone.
Everybody's spoken, so I'll take David's lead and say, does anybody else want to jump in? David, why don't you start, and then we'll open back up.
Cool. So I think I've thought about this question about the short-term, medium, and long-term, especially around the Democratic Party for the past few years. And I think that my conclusion is, like, I think it's kind of sometimes the wrong frame to ask, not an incorrect, but I think we need to take a step back. And I think that none of the long, short-term, even if we're talking about coordination, our strategy actually are talking about changing the rules, changing both how the party functions, changing how people are elected, which I think is something I do respect for Larry Cohen kind of brings up, where he says, like, why are people so not interested in this, even though it's boring, but inside baseball about how do you actually elect people in who controls the Democratic Party, because it does affect how primaries are run. The superdelegates is kind of the quintessential example, though it kind of can be exaggerated. So I think that if you aren't really talking about, and this is not something I work on day to day, so it's not a criticism of anyone, but if you're not really thinking about public financing or instant runoff voting or other reforms, you kind of are stuck with the status quo, which means that I think it's not I've rejected realignment since I'm like 25 years old as actually something that's going to happen. So I think it's like, you're not going to push out these corporate Democrats in mass. They're not everyone wants to be a Republican. And if there's not going to be a third party for the moderates, for the far right, in the end, what you're doing is, I think, which is totally fine, is you're fighting for the progressives to be the dominant faction of the Democratic Party, not the exclusive faction. So it's like kind of where I reject a Trotskyist view of the world that, you can just enter in and then suddenly everything will be, one perfect line. I don't think that. I think it's like there'll continue to be class struggle through the Democratic Party, but you could have a party where the majority of members in Congress are members of the Progressive Caucus, where the Democratic Party agenda is not only progressive on paper, but is something they follow through with. With that, I don't think it's going to happen with absent serious changes to how the party is structured in electoral law. That there won't be corporate Democrats, there won't be blue dog Democrats. It's just all part of a two-party system. So that's kind of always been my 2 cents. And I think, like, what we're all doing is really important. And I think that sometimes I'm not interested in questions about dirty break or not. That's just my 2 cents.
I'd like to get on stack.
Go ahead, Mo. Yeah, and Beth, I saw you doing a lot of nodding, so I might come to you in a minute. But Mo, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, no, I do want to kind of also maybe just reiterate that point around, I think in terms of our policy agenda, I do think focusing on structural reforms of both the economy and our democracy is where I think it makes the most sense for us to coalesce. Whatever our particular issue focus, when we have opportunities to either through executive power, where we have progressives or leftists with executive power on the local, statewide, or national level, or where we have legislative power, number one, our agenda has to be transforming the structures of our economy and our democracy. And I think the right wing is very good at having that level of focus around changing the structures, because, you know, essentially almost every single thing that they do, when you think through the prism of, does this weaken the ability of working class people to engage in our democracy, either workers' democracy through having strong workers' organizations and grassroots organizations and unions, or through the practical sort of tools of our democracy through the ballot. All of these reforms that the right wing are pushing dilutes our power and locks in their power. And we need to have a similar sort of power analysis towards what are the reforms and structural reforms that we're advancing that advance the power broadly of working people and dilute and constrain the power of organized capital. And I think and then the other thing is the two-party duopoly. We need to aggressively, even in the short term, begin to engage in a popular conversation around the fact that it limits the ability of everyday people and working people and people with minority political opinions to be able to advance their agenda. And we need to expand the parameters of it through fusion, ranked choice with multi-member districts, and then, you know, discuss other things like the Electoral College and the Senate and other structures that are fundamentally anti-democratic, and begin to engage in the cultural battle in order for people to understand these things that some people just accept as being sort of part of like common sense of what it needs to be, what our democracy needs to look like, and begin to kind of challenge these institutions, right? So I think that's critical, and that could happen on the short term, long term, and then intermediate level. There's different tactics that could allow for that to happen. But yeah, we need to expect, like, I'm building a political party, so I'm looking towards a long-term end where third parties actually could get over the spoiler sort of a conundrum, and folks could en masse be able to vote their conscience without engaging in spoiler activity. And the two-party duopoly kind of prevents that. In the short term, we're going to use the Democratic primary as a site of struggle, because that's the terrain that we could operate under. But in the long term, we have to expand the terrain.
Awesome, thank you. I think a commonality is that people are interested in sort of challenging both culturally, but also practically challenging sort of the fact of the entire party system, both the two-party system and the system within the Democrats is sort of just a rigged system that needs challenging and transformation. And at the very least in the short term, there's sort of the horizon that John put out of, we have a 40 million person natural base, and there's just a question of those forces largely being unorganized, or not by us organized anyway at the moment. So there's just a question of how do we build that base. And then, I think there's excitement about structural reform. What else do people want to put out in terms of the long-term strategy? What's possible in the electoral realm?
I would add that for a lot of youngish people, kind of the quote unquote millennials, I think so many of us came up through hope and then disillusionment as part of the Obama coalition, and there was a real sense that capitalism didn't work for us, and in a really shocking set of realizations in 2008, and then all of us had to make some kind of crappy decision that we were too young to make, and that was politically grounding in lots of ways. And then in 2015 and 2016, we realized that neoliberalism really didn't work for us too. And so I think that there's that natural voting block that we need to organize, and we need to do it in a way that is more ideologically coherent than the Obama coalition. And we have a real opportunity in the long term to demonstrate the contradictions within the Obama coalition that many young people came to be disillusioned with through Occupy Wall Street, through the 2016 primary, and beyond. And then to Maurice's point, I think that there are lots of, in addition to the electoral reforms that David had mentioned, there are lots of reforms that increase the power of working class people, whether that means rent control to stop the way that gentrification erodes the voting bloc of people time and time again. Because, I mean, so much of our theory around how to organize voters is based off of, registering people to vote where they currently live. And so when we build power in communities, every time a family gets evicted, that's just an erosion off of the voting bloc, one family at a time. The other piece is increasing rates of unionization, making sure that employers have less power over workers through transformative reforms like Medicare for All. I now work a lot on the 2020 census for my day job. The right has a real strategy to decrease the power of people who are not citizens through the inclusion of the citizenship question, which I think is leading to a Supreme Court case to make redistricting about citizens instead of all people who live in a district. And so there are lots of, some of what we need to do is redefine who is the we and cohere it into a voting bloc that has at least some very transformative social democratic reforms leading to greater long-term transformation. But I think that there are lots of young people who saw something happen in 2008 that was a mix of just deep resentment towards capitalism and some hope that just led to a lot of disillusionment. And I think that there's a real opportunity for organizing young people in a voting bloc on the left.
Thanks, Beth. That was great. We're likely to move on soon to talk a bit about 2020, but I want to give one last chance to somebody else to jump in on this question, one of our panelists.
So I think for us within our statewide alignment group, when we were setting our long-term vision and what we call our North Star, it was really around breaking the back of Jim Crow and asserting non-patriarchal governing power. And then to start to map out what does it look like to expand democracy, to end the criminalization of communities of color and young people, and build community wealth. And I think one of the things that we found on that journey is like the just the importance of creating that space to really engage in that radical imagining and visioning together, and how often we shortchange that process. And I think just to kind of point to two examples, like really concrete examples to ground that is, in crisis, there's opportunity. And I think when we don't have those kinds of roadmaps, there are oftentimes opportunities that we miss. So whether that's like the work of people to be inside the Democratic Party, so that positioned in such a way that in the last cycle we got the Florida Democratic Party to agree to not take private prison money, and then that spread to California and to other places. But I think that it requires a certain amount of foresight and making sure that people are positioned to move things like that. And then I think the second example I wanted to point to is just in this moment of for us having had a trifecta in the state where Republicans had controlled both houses of the state legislature and the governor's mansion for so long, to think about what it would be like to have somebody in the governor's mansion and what kinds of opportunities would open up. Really required us to go issue by issue and trying to like wildly churn out memos, like putting out what we would want to advance in the first 90 days on everything from climate to criminalization to immigrant rights. And I think that exercise, I think, really pushed us not only to really walk out what it is that we want, but also helps us create those kinds of roadmaps that then makes it more possible for you to take advantage of opportunities when they arise.
That's great, Andrea. Perfect. I'd love to move on to the 2020 question, but let me get Luke for a closing comment on this one.
Yeah, so just two things that struck me listening to folks. One, Beth mentioned unions and kind of employers, and I guess it just, I feel like it's important to say on this call that if the labor movement in its current form is not transformed and revitalized, I think it's going to be really hard to imagine, kind of a left majoritarian governing coalition. The way I think about it is that, like, as long as the society is based in wage labor, that organized labor is going to have a very unique and relatively independent funding model, although, as we often see, not as independent as we want. And so I just see two tasks: doing new organizing at work, and also, electing progressive leadership within existing trade unions as being essential to having a, kind of well-funded, powerful kind of governing coalition, electorally speaking. And then the second thing I just wanted to say, I guess my thought on what a kind of reasonable thing to say a long-term goal is that we want like a left intersectional hegemony within a majoritarian governing coalition. And so on this question of whether that happens exclusively through the Democratic Party after the Democratic Party fractures, or as a result of electoral reforms that allow a multi-party system, I'm agnostic on that, but I think I am clear that we are looking for that, kind of left intersectional hegemony inside of a majoritarian coalition that can really, move like fundamental changes to this economy at the federal level. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Awesome. Good way to close out, Luke. I'm going to toss it over to Linda.
All good. And again, thanks to all of you. So I think we're rounding up on our time, but I do want to see if we can get some commentary on grounding how we see our work in the run-up to 2020 in relationship to longer-term goals. So I think on this call, we really wanted to, and you all have spoken outside of the 2020 frame. A lot of conversations really get stuck in the immediate. So now I think we want to turn to how, what are the kinds of initiatives, or what are the ways in which we might work in the run-up to 2020 that would be in service to some of the longer term goals that we've been talking about in the electoral arena. And which is to say, by the time we come out of 2020, regardless of what happens, and all kinds of things could happen, as we know, where would we like to be? How do we, as a left, want to come out of this particular cycle? And I'm just going to open it up to anybody who's got a comment on that one.
I think, the challenges of the left between now and whenever somebody emerges from the presidential Democratic primary is to have moved the political center to sort of our North Star in such an effective way that whoever emerges has emerged transformed by the work that we do. And we're able to demonstrate that because they are advancing some points of our line in ways that they wouldn't have if we hadn't made interventions between now and whenever that person emerges. Then we need to consolidate around that vehicle, not because we agree with everything or even partially agree with that person, but because we need to defeat Trump. And I think we need to actually engage in the debate in the left, and I think there will be, around around that question, whether it makes sense to consolidate around a candidate who may be flawed, who may not agree with on every issue, as a vehicle to build a united front to defeat Trump. But we have to make sure that that momentum as a left puts us in a position where we could engage with all of the forces to the right of us that are part of that united front to defeat, if we're successful, so that we could advance our agenda past Election Day. And I think one of the tests directly after Election Day will be, if we're victorious and Trump loses, will the left be able to negotiate in any real way with the victor in the critical weeks and months before inauguration, when they line up basically their governing agenda and their personnel and, you know, their cabinet officials and the hundreds to thousands of officials that they get to hire in order to staff up the various columns of their administration. Will we be in any way part of those conversations? And will we be able to negotiate in that conversation? If we're completely out, then I think that's a stress test that demonstrates that we didn't amass the capacity in order to engage that at that critical point. And as we know, so much of what an administration will be able to execute is kind of decided by the personnel. And so I think that's just like a critical sort of like indicator of our relative strength. Like, I don't think we should delude ourselves into thinking that we will be like the main negotiator, but will we be in the room and we'll be able to negotiate from a position of strength on key things in that moment. So yeah, some ideas.
Other folks on, thank you for that. And are there other folks on this question of what we need to do and where we want to be in 2020? Yeah, John.
Yeah, and I agree with a lot of what Mo just put out there. And I would just say we've been in a position for the last period of time where if it's a center-left electoral, national, or federal coalition, we've been the sort of turnout troops, but not in a very strong position in terms of dictating policy, who's up there in front, who's running it, and all that sort of stuff, whether that's Obama or anybody else. And it seems like with the sort of election of the AOCs and the sort of emerging left, electoral left, if you will, on one hand, and then with, I think, the failure. I mean, I'm in Virginia, so I can talk about top 2 elected officials in blackface and another charged with sexual assault. So it sort of gives us a clarity. And I think what we need to figure out is how do we sort of sever some or create wedges between the sort of corporate Democrats and sort of use that to build a center left within the fraction. I'm going to argue that we do need some level of capitalists at this stage in time, and I'm going to say it's higher tech capital needs to be blocking with the folks who are going to be mobilizing to win an election. But I think you can turn from more center to more left by challenging, for example, Amazon, which is also coming to Virginia on top of everything else. How do you start raising questions about treating that as a public utility? How do you sort of break up the monopoly, sort of like going back to the busting the trust or whatever back in the 1850s or 80s, a little bit before my time, but I read about it. And so to me, it's like that option to sort of both block with the sector of capital, but start trying to regulate and change how it's in relationship through this electoral process is hopefully a way we can start shifting in terms of the race, class, gender forces in a more left center instead of a center left sort of electoral coalition.
Just say something real quickly if I could.
Yeah.
This is very basic, but one thing that's been on my mind is if Bernie doesn't wind up with the nomination and we are essentially working with a kind of neoliberal centrist Democrat, like what scripts do we use at the doors? Like, a lot of what we're going to do is go talk to voters and turn people out. And so what do we say to them? Like, how do we describe why we're engaging in this race and, why we're there at the door for someone that, in many ways we don't agree with. And so I mean, that's just like a really basic thing that I've had in my mind. Like, what do I want to say when I go talk to a voter? And then as organizations, how are we going to talk to the millions of people that we manage to talk to when we're talking on behalf of a candidate that we, that we don't totally trust? And so I think, like, I don't know, someone should write up, a good door script for us to all think about.
All good. Any last words on this one, on this last question?
I'd like to get on stack if there's no one else who wants.
Go right ahead.
So just quickly, I think for me, the 2020 strategy is not just about the presidency. It's about building networks from now to then of the elected officials that our Revolution DSA are kind of starting to do. But I think the key thing is like creating cooperative relationships. I think that there's this like bizarre fetishization among, I think, especially the newer developed folks of accountability, quote unquote, whatever that means, not seeing that, elected officials aren't either somebody we worship as gods or our mortal enemy, but giving them, ways to govern, giving them legislation, figuring out ways to amplify them when they do good. And I think that's going to be critical to keeping people excited and maturing a political program that can be incredibly effective in turning out votes, regardless, as kind of pushing back on Luke a little bit. Like if we have people going out to vote for good people, they're probably going to vote up ticket too, and I think that's a critical thing to do as well.
Great. If there's nobody else burning on this one, is there anybody else burning? Because otherwise I'm going to kind of round us out. We're at 6:30 and I know everybody's time is super valuable. So how are we doing? You all good with me rounding us out? Okay, I'm just going to, first of all, I want to really thank everybody, especially organizing Upgrade and especially to Rishi, who did the lion's share of the organizing to get us all into this conversation. And to all of the panelists for really thoughtful and wise contributions to the conversation. I think, so just drawing on some of the things that have come up in the conversation, and there are many things I think that deserve a longer, more focused discussion. But I think already we noted that there's advances from 2016. There's experiments and conversations that are going on, including the one that we've had today, that were simply not on the agenda 2 years ago. And thanks to folks who noted also the work that comes out of the Black Lives movement and the kind of post-Ferguson generation that contributed to the revitalization of the left. So I think the past 2 years, also folks have really grounded themselves in the stakes that there are in finding ways to power at the municipal, county level, state, and national level. Those stakes are really in stark relief. That is one thing that the 2016 election did. And everybody but the most intransigent folks, I think at this point, have moved past forms of abstentionism and the true but too easy refrain that neither of the two parties of corporate capital are going to lead us to radical transformation, much less liberation. So that's all true, but it doesn't speak to the problem that we're currently facing. So I really did appreciate in our conversation about higher levels of cooperation on the left, trying to tease that apart a little bit and drawing especially the distinction between alignment and cooperation, or alignment and coordination, and understanding the importance of the development of clarity about kind of what's the political frame of that alignment that starts to cut across issues of cut across issues, demographics, and geographies. I also appreciated in our conversation raising up the ways in which the Gillum and Abrams races changed our understanding of what's possible in organizing, and kind of some of the underestimation of our own capacity when folks really get situated on the ground. So I think there are things there that will, and lessons there, and I'm looking forward to deeper conversations about those races to frame what's possible going forward. I think there are also a lot of issues that were touched on that we still need to explore more deeply, including some of the longer term strategy questions vis-a-vis the Democratic Party. There were some differences in emphasis around the importance of inside baseball. That inside baseball being particularly, as I understood it, not just the attention to elections and the ground, the work on the ground that it takes to win elections, but also to kind of what's going on internal to the party structures, who's getting elected to what and why, allocations of resources in the party, et cetera. And so there's on the one hand, some conversation about that, but also about slightly different emphasis on what it would take to expand the terrain beyond these, beyond the two parties. I also appreciated some commentary about, and I think this is a longer conversation that we absolutely need to have, which is the relationship between independent political organization, ongoing grassroots organizing, and electoral work, such that the electoral work is not simply kind of an extractive exercise. And then I'm already running out of time, but so I'll just say I also did appreciate toward the end that commentary about the labor movement's role. So this is really no joke right there, which is there are many forces on the left, the absence of a strong left within the labor movement, and the ability of that left to kind of bridge the relationship between labor organizing and electoral organizing and work in concert with the social justice left. That's a conundrum that needs to be solved. So I don't know, I think I'm gonna leave it there. There's a lot more that came out in this conversation. I really appreciate hearing from folks, and I'm imagining that Rishi might too, on some of the topics that got touched upon, but that we weren't able to go into as deeply as we might have. That might be fodder for future conversations. And Rishi, I'm assuming you're going to have the last word.
Well, I'll leave the last real substantive word to you because that was all brilliant. And I'll just echo all of the thanks. This was an amazingly rich discussion, and also with this many people and this much time, inevitably we touched a number of things, and Linda just, did a great job of outlining all of the various questions that still remain, including a number that came up in the chat box. And I think sort of the question of candidates that came up in the chat box is, for better or worse, is the immediate way that a lot of people sort of will be engaging in the 2020, at least thinking about 2020, sort of the role of candidates and how we should be thinking about them. So organizing upgrades, figuring out sort of its next steps. There very well might be in the summer another chance to do a panel of this sort and tackle some of the stuff we didn't get to. This recording is going to appear sometime over the next 1 or 2 weeks on Organizing Upgrade, along with some excerpts from it. So stay tuned and please share. And we'll be back in touch about next steps. Keep reading Organizing Upgrade. Thank you so much to all of the panelists. You all are brilliant. And we'll see you all on the streets. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Rishi, thanks, Linda.